What is meant by the language access program? I ask you to think of it in its constituent parts. It asks districts to start with a self-assessment. Where are they? What sort of provisions do they make? What are the needs? To adopt a plan. A plan can be thought of as a roadmap. It identifies some of the pieces that need to be attended to, sets up a timeline, and sets up who would be responsible for doing those things. It asks districts to use the guide. The guide is part of the toolkit that OSPI will make available. Districts are open to using that guide if they choose to, but it is there for their support as a resource. It's basically like a manual. Also, it asks them to review the policy and procedures periodically and to make many of those pieces publicly available. So I had mentioned the language access liaison. So that's for this coming school year. For the following school year, 23-24, school districts that meet these criteria, either one of these criteria, there are more than 75 languages spoken by families and or students, or at least 50% of the students are English learner designated. Those districts, and it's approximately 14 by the current data, are required to name a language access coordinator. So that is a person who is specifically named as a contact person for community members, for our office, OSPI, for district staff. And that is a full-time equivalent position. So there could be one person that's named for a full-time position, or if the work is distributed, say among 2 or 3 people, cumulatively, they can report, the district can report the hours that equal a full-time position for that work. HB 1153 also calls for OSPI to do something specifically, and the major piece of that is the Language Access Technical Assistance Program. We're asked to provide resources for school districts. We're asked to provide consultations if districts feel that that might be helpful. I had mentioned the glossaries that made its way into the legislation, in addition to training modules. So we are asked to put together a set of training modules that would be available for interpreters. I'm looking right now at the kind of content that might best be included in there. And then, of course, we have to look for contracting for that. The toolkit, which I had mentioned previously, and the Language Access Advisory Committee, and I'll speak to that in just a moment. And this last piece, our collaboration with the agency known as PSB, that is the Professional Educator Standards Board, and I'll speak to that in just a second as well. So this advisory committee, this is an ongoing committee, or it is designated as an ongoing committee, and it is charged with guiding and monitoring the implementation of House Bill 1153 and its provisions. And it is to be made up of some of the same groups that participated in the work group, with a special edition of people, representatives from schools and districts. This is something we feel will be very important for that advisory committee, so that the districts can remind the committee, remind those involved of some of the challenges that they might be facing and some of the realities of what it means to put this into play. And so that can be a well-informed committee. Now, the committee, we're working on the planning stages of it. We're in the planning stages of it now. We are hoping to have the first meeting in late September, maybe around September 20th, September 21st. And so we are looking at what might be part of our bylaws and our charter at this moment. And so then we'll go ahead and send out invitations for members to be able to submit an application. This is a very important piece. So I had mentioned the Professional Educator Standards Board. This agency is charged principally with determining and overseeing the requirements to be credentialed as a teacher or as a paraprofessional, paraeducator in the state of Washington. In this bill's language, that agency is charged with not just collaborating with PSB, but also, and importantly, determining credentialing requirements for interpreters to interpret in school type appointments. And it's an important piece because one of the two strands of this, I think of it as two strands. One is what are districts being asked to do OSPI, and the other is how can we help make sure that there is a pool of qualified, competent interpreters, primarily, also people who can do translation, so that there is a pool to draw on to be able to interpret well for these kinds of appointments. So we'll work with PSB. We'll provide them with any information that they feel is necessary. But ultimately, PSB will be making the determination around those credentialing requirements. They will consider some of those suggestions or recommendations I had mentioned earlier, such as whether or not there should be a tiered system, what kind of testing might be considered acceptable, whether or not they want to try to develop a test for interpreters on their own. So they have their work cut out for them. And then briefly, this is just a timeline overall of some of the pieces. And so I won't spend too much time here. I know I've kind of gone over the time I had thought I might take. So I'm happy to try to respond to any questions. And Lynn, if this is helpful, I'll send another version of this, which basically has these points. I'll send that to you afterwards, which you would be free to share as you saw appropriate.